And today I'll be discussing the article Transforming Sex, Christine Jorgensen in the Post-War U.S., written by Joanne Marowitz. To start, I just wanted to go over some learning objectives that I've created. The first being to understand the difference between sex and gender, discover Christine Jorgensen's impact on the understanding of gender dysphoria and sex change operations, and finally be able to recount the evolution of transgender understanding, what it means to be a woman and a man and anything in between, and the fellow civil rights movements at the time. The final one simply means that you'll be able to understand from the perspective of the 50s, the 1950s to modern day, and even the 50s to the 60s of how our understanding on being transgender has changed, which in turn kind of relates to our understanding of what it means to be a woman or a man, and also how the fellow civil rights movement at the time kind of interlaced itself with the transgender movement and how everything was kind of woven together. The thesis, or the main idea of the article, is to highlight the life of Christine Jorgensen and share her impact on how we view gender dysphoria, sex change operations, and gender. Some quotes that kind of provide evidence for this thesis. I have a few here. I'm going to go ahead and read them all just to kind of explain my reasoning. The first one is from page 16. It says, "But on a closer examination, Jorgensen's story provides a critical entry point into 20th century tensions over science and sexuality." I think that one's pretty straightforward. Again, it kind of ties in with the learning objectives of how we started viewing sexuality versus science. Next, it states, "In an era when others were questioning the hierarchies of race and gender, Jorgensen forced her public to think about the very definition of biological sex," which is an important conversation to have, of course. Next states, "Over and over, letters written offered support, commended her courage, and sympathized with her struggles to be the person she wanted to be. Meanwhile, a steady stream of sensational stories on other transsexuals established that Jorgensen was not alone." I included this quote to kind of add to her impact that I included on the learning objective, because as you can see, she started getting so many letters, not only from people who were also transgender, but from people who were just supporting her and kind of understood what it felt like to not be able to be the person you wanted, or to be ostracized for being the person you want to be. And then again, with the sentence following that, with more and more stories were coming out. Of course, they were overly sensationalized, but more and more stories were coming out of people who were transitioning and who were transgender, which was a huge deal since Jorgensen was kind of solely kind of taking this bear publicly, you know. Next, it states, "Inevitably, Jorgensen's story also brought issues of sexuality into the news." Again, this is just like a little blurb. You can see more on page 19 of just that conversation of sexuality that is innately kind of interwoven in this. Next, it says, "In 1955, they began to replace psychological sex with the term gender, and a few years later, gender identity." Again, most of these quotations also tie into the learning objectives that I provided. So like this is an example about how even within like 5 years, or just being in the mid-1950s, we saw a transition from terminology, like a new language was basically forming, and to better represent what people were going through. So instead of having psychological sex, it was replaced with gender, and kind of now we see a lot more like gender identity. All right, next is, "Although the doctors disagreed then and now over what exactly determined it, they agreed that gender identity, the sex one felt oneself to be, was not necessarily determined by the gonads, genitals, or chromosomes generally used to define biological sex." Again, this just adds into the difference between sex and gender, and how, even though of course it is still debated today, and of course back then, there was kind of seeing some movement in terms of, okay, we're understanding that you can have a different gender than your biological sex. Second to last is, "Jorgensen pushed her readers to consider whether and why the very same person was somehow more acceptable as a heterosexual woman than she had been when living as a feminine man attracted to other men." This ties in with the sexuality portion of the article, how Jorgensen was really discriminated against and really faced a lot of turmoil when she was a man because she was very feminine and attracted to other men, and kind of that discourse of why is it okay for one but not the other. Not that her being transgender was okay in the eyes of a lot of people, but it's just providing kind of an insight of saying, why is it okay to be a feminine woman attracted to a man but not a feminine man attracted to another man. And lastly, from page 20, it states, from the late 1960s on, transsexuals themselves began to organize for their civil rights, drawing on the existing movements for racial justice, feminism, and gay liberation. They called for an end to police brutality, employment discrimination, and medical maltreatment. Again, this really ties into that last learning objective I provided, because as you can see, with those who were transgender, who were people of color, who were gay, etc., were all kind of facing very similar forms of discrimination. So in turn, they were all fighting for the same things for the most part. Obviously, it differed depending on whether it be because of race or gender or sexuality, etc. But it's really important to see that distinction of, they were building off of each other and oftentimes fighting for each other, since they all kind of understood to some extent what the other people were going through. This is just a little blurb that I wrote about kind of modern day discussions on an old discourse, because while reading this article, it's very clear that even though this was written, the article itself wasn't written in the 50s, but Christine Jorgensen's life as being openly transgender took place in the 50s. The conversations that she had, the statements that she provided, and a lot of the discourse that was shown in the article are things that are very, very relevant still today. So I'm just going to read this quickly and discuss it, because I wanted to show that there is a modern day application to this that is important to understand. So I wrote, even though Jorgensen's story made waves over 70 years ago, the same discourse and rhetoric are still major topics of discussion today. As a society, we are becoming much more progressive and open when it comes to gender. However, it is still a heated debate. Similar to the doctors and general public's reaction to Christine Jorgensen's transition and ideologies, as a population, we are heavily split. Most people understand the difference between sex and gender, as highlighted in this article, as well as are generally accepting of all people the way they are. Unfortunately, there are still so many people who are fully against this. This can be seen in Congress, as even in 2022, new laws and bills are being passed every day that inhibit the lives of transgender people, homosexuals, women, people of color, etc. This is all incredibly reminiscent of Jorgensen's life and the lives of all openly transgender people at the time, as they had to fight to legally change their name and get gender-affirming surgeries. Clearly not much has changed, since most people's personal decisions on what they do with their body are still under close watch and control of the government and their state's officials. So this can be really seen in Texas, how people are kind of trying to fight for the protection of trans youth, since it is kind of becoming an issue in terms of a parent letting their child transition to a different gender can be seen as child abuse and certain things like this, which, although is not exactly what Christine Jorgensen was facing or those who were transgender at the time were facing, but it is just a new version of that. That's why I kind of entitled it Modern Day Discussions on an Old Discourse, because we're seeing it evolve yet still be cyclical in somehow. So I included some discussion questions as well. For this side, I have 3. So the first one is very obvious if you based on the learning objectives and kind of the whole point of the PowerPoint, but the first question is, what is the difference between sex and gender, and how was this distinction made? So of course, again, if you look back at the evidence I provided, there are a few quotations that already kind of answer this question, and then if you go back to those pages in the article, it will completely kind of spell it out. But I added the how was this distinction made, because I do think it's important to see kind of that evolution of it. Second are, what are some examples of discrimination transgendered individuals faced at the time, and are they still happening today? Again, it's all kind of in the evidence I provided, but this is also one that you can kind of think to, like, personally and think modern day, kind of how, whether that be like employment discrimination, etc. And is it still happening today, even 70 years plus later? And then finally, this one's just more of a personal question as well. It says, what do you think was Christine Jorgensen's biggest impact on society? I just mean in terms of like, was the fact that she was openly transgender and in the public eye, did that impact more of like other people being openly transgender, or the acceptance? Do you think the bigger impact was our view on gender or sex affirming surgeries or sexuality as a whole, etc., etc.? Again, it's just kind of an interesting viewpoint I would like to hear. Finally, for the student activity portion of the PowerPoint, I asked everyone to, who do you think could be considered a modern day Christine Jorgensen, and in turn provide examples of how they are similar to Jorgensen in any way you see fit, as well as a general description of your chosen person. So, for an example, I chose Dylan Mulvaney. So Dylan, and I'm going to read a little bit of some little blurbs that I wrote about her and how I feel that they are similar to Christine Jorgensen as an example. So first, Dylan is a transgender woman who is making waves currently on social media apps, specifically TikTok. They have been documenting their quote-unquote days of girlhood on TikTok since her transition, which is a very popular series that I'm sure most people have seen at one point or another. She is known for their positivity and hyperfemininity, which is really refreshing. Also, Dylan goes by she, they pronouns, which is why you can hear me kind of using both, if you were wondering. And I think this is really great since she is a public figure, because it really challenges, again, more of that idea of gender, because I think a lot of people still believe that once you're transgender and you transition, you can't have non-binary pronouns, similar to how in the past, and I'm sure even still, many people think that if you're transgender, you can't be gay at the same time, which of course is very incorrect. But I just think it's really great to see that, to see somebody who is quote unquote hyper feminine also have non-binary pronouns and is open about that kind of stuff. I believe that she can be coined as being the modern day Christine Jorgensen, as they currently have 9.3 million followers on TikTok and has recently been making their way to traditional media, because she's arguably the most openly transgender woman at the moment, in my opinion. Also, another way that she is similar to Jorgensen is that she is seen as a controversial figure. Despite not having like problematic viewpoints or anything, she is considered controversial, which is evident by the boycott of Ulta after the brand featured her in an ad, simply because Dylan is transgender. Which again isn't necessarily exactly the same as Jorgensen with like the boycott scenario, but it is just a reality that kind of makes them a bit more similar. Finally, her message of positivity and gender and activism as a whole has spread worldwide, making her an important figure of representation for the transgender community. They are spreading kindness and happiness in a way that's changing the way that many people view life, how many people view being transgender and gender as a whole and sexuality, which is really great to see, especially on an app that is so that can reach so many people like TikTok. So that's the end. Here's my works cited page. Again, I was mainly working off of Joanne Merowitz's piece from the OAH Magazine of History, which was entitled Transforming Sex, Christine Jorgensen in the Post-War U.S. I hope you really enjoyed my presentation and learned a little bit about Christine Jorgensen and being transgender and sexuality and gender as a whole and everything in between. So thank you for listening.